Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at King's Politics. I'm Miz, one of the co-chairs at King's Politics, and we are delighted to be joined by Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart is a former politician, academic, and diplomat. He was MP for Pentrith and the Border from 2010 to 2019. He served in 4 different government departments, notably in the cabinet as Secretary of State for International Development in May 2019. He's a senior fellow at Yale's Institute for Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us. And I guess as the first question is, what were your initial reactions to the Sue Gray report, albeit a heavily redacted form due to the police investigation?
I think the first thing is that the report is very clear that the number 10 failed. In her words, failed to meet the standards that you would expect of the government, failed to meet the standards that you'd expect of the general public. So there has been clearly a very, very serious breach of standards by the people that are meant to be setting the rules. And it's pretty straightforward. It implies that number 10, which is meant to be in charge of not just defining what we do in COVID, but setting an example on how to conduct ourselves in COVID, has completely failed to set that example. And to make it worse, appears to have lied about it.
I guess, do you think Boris Johnson has benefited from the police investigation and the heavily redacted form of the Sue Gray's report? When it was released, he seemed defiant. He says, I get it and I'll fix it.
Well, he's hoping, as usual, to slip through. He's slipped through many, many things in his life. He's had more than 30 years of evading responsibility and getting away with things. And so he'll hope that he can do the thing again. I would say, however, I think that he's probably quite badly damaged now. His opinion poll ratings are very, very low. Many of the people who once supported him now no longer see the point of him. And remember, he has a strange legacy, which is that he's developed a reputation for flakiness and dishonesty, which didn't matter so much when he seemed to be successful. But when things begin to collapse, they can collapse quite quickly around someone with that kind of character.
I guess you mentioned that he was trying to, slide out of this. Have you reassessed your chance of Boris Johnson surviving the scandal, or do you think things will get progressively worse, either the outcome of the police investigation or further scandals unfolding?
I think he's doomed. It's very difficult to believe that he can fully recover or run in another election. I apologize, you can hear the azan behind me. I'm speaking to you from Amman in Jordan, so apologies for the background noise. I think that when the May elections come and people experience, MPs experience directly on the doorstep how angry the public is, they will realize that the longer they hang on to Boris Johnson, the more trouble the Conservative Party is in. One of the Conservative Party's traditions is it's very ruthless in getting rid of its leaders. And I suspect they're going to do that again, and they'll have to do that again. Because the longer they hold on to him, the more they're put into the impossible situation of trying to justify the unjustifiable.
In Parliament, Boris Johnson has, of course, repeated multiple lies, from associating Keir Starmer to the Jimmy Savile case, to repeatedly claiming that more people on work before the pandemic began, despite the Office for Statistics Regulation stating that this was not true. What does this say about our politics, and why is he able to fundamentally get away with this?
Well, fundamentally, he can get away with it because large sections of the public don't care. They warm to him, they like him, there's a sort of Boris they love, and that doesn't seem to relate to whether or not he tells the truth, whether or not he's actually competent, whether or not he's a decent prime minister. There seems to be a sort of fatal split between what it takes to get elected and governing well. And Boris is very much betting everything on the what it takes to get elected and betting that people don't really care about how the country's run. Now, there are many complicated reasons why people may not care about where the country's run, including deep pessimism. They may doubt whether anyone can run the country, and therefore they don't really mind that Boris appears to be failing. But it's certainly a real issue that we now have a prime minister who is less serious than I think any prime minister we've ever had in British history.
In a recent tweet, you said that Boris Johnson is a symptom of a much broader problem in British politics, which can only be fixed by new policies and almost certainly new parties and a new electoral system. What specific change do you advocate for, and is first past the post problematic in terms of an electoral system?
Yeah, first past the post is problematic And one of the main reasons it's problematic for me is that it stops new entrants. It stops somebody creating a new party and proving it and establishing it. So in the German system or the Israeli system or in the French system, it's possible to create a new party and with the electoral system, even with a few percent of the vote, establish yourself in parliament, prove yourself, and over time build your credibility, form coalitions, practice government, and ultimately get to leadership. That's not possible in Britain. It's almost impossible for a small party to take more than 1 or 2 seats in parliament. And that means that, and that would be true even if the party got 15, 20% of the vote nationally. That is a big, big problem because it basically leaves us in the stranglehold of the Labour and Conservative parties and the pathologies of those parties, their mad behaviour.
I guess you have touched upon this, but to what extent does Partygate cause permanent harm to the electoral success of the Conservatives? And do you think Boris Johnson will continue to be an electoral asset as many Tory MPs perceive him to be?
I can't believe that he can continue to be an electoral asset now. I mean, look, he was always a pretty implausible figure. It was pretty weird that the British public essentially decided to vote in somebody whose professional career had essentially been made in comedy. The guy was a kind of comedian and had no record at all in government and never gave any sign that he was interested in detail. In fact, his entire style wasn't just comic. I mean, that's true of Zelenovsky in Ukraine. It's weird. It's a type of comedy which is predicated on incompetence and absent-mindedness and dishonesty. It's a very particular type of comedy. It's a very odd type of comedy to put in as Prime Minister. So I think when the consequences of that become clear, as they now are becoming, I think it is very unlikely that he remains an electoral asset.
I guess another aspect of the British political system you have been critical about is the whipping system. And I guess I believe you called the whipping system effectively an elected dictatorship. How would you advocate for the removal of the whipping system or replacement?
You can't quite remove the whipping system. The question is how much power the whips have. Not only is it in the interests of a party to try to exercise discipline, it's also in a sense in the interests of democracy as a whole. If there's no structural discipline within a party, it's impossible for the public to expect a manifesto to be carried through. So broadly speaking, the democratic function of the whips is to make sure that if you voted for the Labour Party and their manifesto, the whips would undertake to try to compel the MPs to vote for those policies. In a world without whips, where everybody just votes as they like on every issue, you end up in a quite different problem, which is the problem effectively that you had traditionally in the United States, which is that you have to buy off each member of parliament. It actually encourages pork barrel politics, it encourages earmarking, it encourages forms of corruption. So this is why Edmund Burke in the 18th century essentially argued for party systems and the whips that underlay them, and argued that the idea of the individual statesman is actually corrupting.
In what manner do you think Boris Johnson will be forced out the party if he is? Do you expect the number of letters to the 1920 committee to exceed the required amount?
Yes, eventually the numbers will exceed the requirement. I mean, it takes some time to do. Remember, Jacob Rees-Mogg and others were plotting to try to get rid of Theresa May, and they made a great big announcement outside the House of Commons that they'd got enough letters to trigger a leadership contest. And they didn't. It was a sort of damp squib, and weeks passed, but eventually the number of letters came in. And even though Theresa May could comfortably win a leadership challenge, she chose to step down. The same was true, of course, with Mrs. Thatcher. It wasn't actually that she, and the same is true with Edward Heath. In these cases, it's sufficient for the leader to be severely damaged, for a lot of MPs to not vote for them to think their position's untenable. Now, it's possible with this particular leader, given that he refuses to follow any rules, and it's almost impossible to imagine him resigning, that he might try to hang on in a weaker position. But that is very, very dangerous for a party. That's effectively what Jeremy Corbyn did with Labour.
Another issue is that Starmer tends to argue that the current crisis is preventing the current government from effectively governing. Do you see Partygate to continuously impede the manner in which Boris Johnson can govern this country?
Well, he's not very interested in governing the country. I mean, Partygate is sort of irrelevant to that. He's chaotic, he's unfocused, he doesn't do detail. He's not, you know, I worked with him when he was Foreign Secretary, and he would say to me things like, Rory, I want you to sort out Libya. Libya is a bite-sized British problem. And then I would say, but Foreign Secretary, you know, we don't have an ambassador in Libya. You know, I'll bring together a proposal for you. Here's a budget. This is what we could do with the Italians. This is what we could do with the UN. And he'd just lose interest. He'd just wander off. Or he'd say, Rory, I want you to sort out charismatic megafauna in Africa. So I'd go away and I'd come back and say, here's a budget. This is what we could do in Zambia with elephants. This is what the Germans are doing. And again, he'd just lose interest, right? This is a guy who thinks like, obviously, I mean, it's his training. He thinks like a guy who produces 800 words, jolly columns in the Telegraph, which say, you know, we're going to save the elephant or we're going to save Libya. But he has absolutely no interest in the difficult business of actually getting things done. He's got no interest in compromise. He's got no interest in money. He's got no interest in slow delivery. The only thing he is interested in, and I think Dominic Cummings gets this right, is he likes the idea of creating monuments. Sort of fantasy that somehow what ancient Rome was about was creating buildings with names on them. It's a very unfortunate fantasy because most of the Roman prefects who put up great buildings with their names on them ended up with those names being reused in sewage pipes or to build steps going up to a dock. So you come across these strange fragments of the names of Roman prefects now buried under the City of London. But that's obviously the legacy that he wants.
You have been critical of both, I guess, Boris Johnson specifically and his personality and sort of the broader political system. I guess, which one is more important in this case? And is Boris Johnson as a prime minister and his personality more unprecedented in comparison to previous prime ministers, whether Conservative or Labour?
Yeah, he's very new. I mean, he's a very strange person. I mean, there's a lot of problems with previous prime ministers, but I can't think of any prime minister who has been so flagrant in their refusal to resign, quite so flagrant in their lack of interest in governing, quite so flagrant in their complete refusal to act with any dignity and seriousness in office. I think in those regards, he's unprecedented.
I want to move on to international issues, specifically, of course, Russia, Ukraine. Many who are perhaps following the story may wonder, what does Russia and Putin want out of Ukraine, and why would they risk war over invading Ukraine?
Well, so clearly for Vladimir Putin, one of the background stories is that he still misses the Soviet Union, and he has fantasies for greater Russia, the Russia of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, which included Ukraine, and included a lot of the Baltic as well, stretched into Poland. So he has a nationalist agenda, and it's an expansionary nationalist agenda. He also does not like the possibility that Ukraine could become closer to the European Union. He doesn't want a prosperous liberal neighbor that is successful. He's running a gangster kleptocracy, a very closed, sinister society that shuts down NGOs and murders political opponents. And he doesn't want on his border a country very, very close to Russia, culturally, historically, taking a different path and taking it successfully. Therefore, he has invented a NATO threat. Therefore, he is massing on the border. And he's gambling that he will be able to extract concessions, that people will, the United States, Germany, France, others will give him concessions in exchange for him not invading, and think they've pulled off some great diplomatic negotiation triumph, when in fact, all they really would have done is given into blackmail.
How does this link with how Putin sees the West? I guess the fall of the West and changing influences in terms of global power.
He believes the West is declining. He thinks that China, and for some eccentric reason, Russia, are on the rise, and that the Western model peaked and is now in freefall, and that therefore he's pushing at the legs of a pretty fragile edifice.
The US is deploying 3,000 troops to Europe within days to strengthen the NATO alliance. Do you believe war is inevitable, or do you think the West can deter Russian aggression in the region through these methods?
Well, I think that the first thing to understand about the deployment of 3,000 troops is that that tells you that the United States has no intention of fighting Russia. Russia has 130,000 soldiers massed on that border. And a normal US deployment to Afghanistan, for example, was over 100,000 soldiers. Right? 3,000 soldiers is meaningless. And 3,000 soldiers would vanish in the first 10 minutes of a conflict against that kind of army. The same is true of Britain's deployments. You know, largely what we're seeing with Boris Johnson in Ukraine seems to me, maybe not largely, but certainly to some extent, simply a distraction from Partygate. He's pretending to be a major global figure and posing as a war leader. But the truth is that neither Britain nor the United States has any capacity to defend Ukraine against a Russian invasion. The only hope for Ukraine is that the West arms Ukraine, and Ukraine would be put into the situation of fighting effectively a counterinsurgency campaign, which is to say, Ukraine would have to turn itself into Iraq or Afghanistan, resisting a foreign military occupation over years. Now, the question is, does Putin want that? Does he want that kind of bloody occupation? Probably not. What he'd prefer is to intimidate Ukraine into bending, get the West to agree to remove the troops, and then bully and bluff and intimidate his way into getting Ukraine to do what he wants.
I guess you touched upon Boris Johnson. He's in a conference in Kiev. He was supposed to have calls with Putin. I wanted to ask about some of these diplomatic means. It means you have been quite pessimistic, citing that Putin isn't sincere about diplomacy. Is there any hope for diplomacy to deal with this issue?
Well, it depends what you mean by diplomacy. I mean, if you said to Putin, we hereby agree that Ukraine can never join NATO, and we hereby agree that we're going to remove all our troops from the Baltic, and we hereby agree that NATO will never expand again, he'll take his troops away. It's easy. So yes, there is a form of diplomatic solution, but that would be outrageous because these are independent countries that have chosen to ally with NATO. Putin is effectively threatening to kill people unless they give him what he wants. And giving in to those demands is not exactly diplomacy.
I wanted to move on to the situation with Afghanistan. I guess one aspect I wanted to touch on is what were your thoughts on the whistleblower report by Raphael Marshall, the idea that thousands of Afghans could not get help due to turmoil in the Foreign Office?
Very convincing. I mean, I think our system is broken, but it's broken from the top. The fish rots from its head. You know, the longer you have somebody like Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, the more useless the entire edifice of government becomes.
I guess adding on to that, I'm sure you heard about the report that there was endeavors to save animals from Afghanistan. Do you tie this with, I guess, systemic issues, or Boris Johnson specifically in regards to foreign affairs?
Well, I mean, that's a sort of classic example of a panicking government unable to maintain a reasonable line, being pushed around by weird bits of social media. I mean, obviously, objectively, it is ridiculous, right, to evacuate dogs. The Taliban have no problem with dogs. The Taliban don't even have any problem with people who look after dogs. They do have a problem with women judges who've been prosecuting the Taliban, right? That's your priority. And the fact that the British public convinced themselves that somehow what they needed to do was immediately evacuate a guy and his dogs is mad, particularly since he'd actually been told, like all British citizens, to leave some days before the Taliban got to Kabul. But it needed a government that was clearer and more articulate. It needed a foreign secretary or a defense secretary who could say what I've just said. And I think if they said what I just said clearly enough, the British public would understand.
The situation in Afghanistan is looking quite bleak. The UN estimates that only 2% have enough to eat, whilst there are reports that parents are selling children and kidneys to survive. What should the international community do to remedy this issue?
Very, very generous and quick assistance. At the moment, very little of the money that's being provided is actually being spent on the ground. There are an enormous number of NGOs with hundreds of staff on the ground that could be deploying that money, that could be helping people that are not receiving that support. And it's a combination of stinginess, lack of political will, anxieties about the Taliban, but it's awful. And people should be much more generous. We should, for example, be paying the salaries of Afghan teachers. No Afghan teacher has been paid since August.
I guess one issue a lot of people may cite with the use of aid is the Taliban regime. How does one approach giving aid to a country when one may not agree with their regime specifically?
Well, it is complicated, of course it is. But the truth of the matter is that you have to try to think what the alternatives are. Starving the Afghan people just because you don't like the Taliban seems like a very bizarre move. Feeding the Afghan people is not going to massively strengthen the Taliban. And I think it's unethical and impractical to engage in starving people just because you don't like the Taliban.
How optimistic do you feel about the long-term future of Afghanistan under the Taliban regime, both in terms of issues such as women's rights and the general welfare of the Afghan people?
Well, I mean, the Taliban basically are not very interested in women's rights. There's not a single woman in the Afghan cabinet. And if you were to suggest they put a woman in the cabinet, they'd laugh at you. Effectively, they have been fighting for 20 years against a moderate Muslim government in Kabul. And President Ghani and President Karzai before him were Muslims, were running an Islamic republic, but were running it in ways that gave more opportunities for women, that had a more open civil society. And in the end, that's what the Taliban were against, right? That's what this whole thing's been about. That's what they've been fighting about for 20 years. They haven't been fighting about economic policy. They haven't been fighting about anything. It's been a culture war to do with imposing a particular vision of Islam, a very strange Southern Pashto version of Islam. So, I mean, I think one should be very worried. And I think one should be worried also, and this isn't the Taliban's fault, but 70% of the Afghan budget was provided by foreign donors. And without that money, you simply cannot support the Afghan state. You can't keep the electricity going. You can't keep the water supply going. You can't pay the teachers. Right? There's nothing. There will be no state.
This will be the final question before I go into audience questions. Many were wondering, do you perhaps not regret staying in politics and I guess leading a more moderate wing of the Conservative Party? And what made you decide to leave the Conservative? And is there any option in the future for a return to frontline politics?
So I think people need to understand what would be involved had I decided to stay in the Conservative Party. I would have had to do two things. I would have had to endorse the idea of a no-deal Brexit, right? Not Brexit, right? I accepted the referendum and was trying to argue for a moderate Brexit, what people called a soft Brexit, a kind of customs union Brexit. But to remain in the Conservative Party, you needed to go into the 2019 election saying that you would be prepared to accept a no-deal Brexit. And you also had to be prepared to go into the 2019 election saying that Boris Johnson would be a great prime minister. And there's the sort of minimum requirements for being a Conservative MP. And you have to go out on television. You can see them day in, day out, saying, no, Prime Minister's a guy of great integrity. He would never lie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these people who apparently are the moderate wing of the Conservative Party have had to make an incredible compromise with Boris Johnson and with a particularly unpleasant vision, right? And have had to defend everything that that government has been doing on immigration, on Europe, on COVID, on Partygate, on Owen Paterson, which everybody seems to have forgotten about, where he attempted to abolish a parliamentary committee that was investigating somebody for lobbying. So, remaining in politics, it didn't seem to me to be an option.
I guess now we'll go to audience questions. If you have a question, you can just put it in the chat box and I will read out any questions you have. One question asks, could you give us an insight into what the country would look like both domestically and internationally if you had won the 2019 Conservative leadership election?
It's a lovely question. I mean, the answer is I don't really know. One of the problems would have been if I'd won that election, I would have had to work out how to face off a very divided party. So the first thing I would have needed to work out is whether it was possible for me to get a compromise Brexit deal through. My vision was a Britain very close to the European Union. I wanted us to be in the customs union. I wanted us to be very close to European institutions. So I suppose I was looking at a model somewhere between Norway and Turkey. Was it possible to do that? Well, Labour claimed that that's what they wanted. So theoretically, it should have been possible to reach across the aisles and make a cross-party agreement. And I hope I would have had the political skills to do that. I also hope that if I'd won the leadership election, I would have had the mandate from the Conservative Party so that I could say to MPs, I'm your new leader, and this is what I said I was going to do, and this is what we're going to do. That would have been the first thing. I would have been much, much tougher on COVID restrictions in February of 2020, because I believe the answer would have been to lock down fast and then lift the restrictions earlier. I think the way that Boris Johnson approached it was the wrong way around. I think he was slow to lock down and then slow to lift. I think that the decisions that have been made around the armed forces, it's a slightly niche area, but I think they're completely mad. Exactly the time when we're confronting Putin and where there is incredible fragility and conflict from Afghanistan across to sub-Saharan Africa, we're fantasizing about some tilt towards China, which is both strategically irrelevant to the United Kingdom and something totally beyond our capacity to deliver. I would have put social care at the center of what we did. Now, obviously, I'm talking to a young audience, but probably the biggest single disgrace in British public life is the way that we look after our elderly. If you are a poor elderly person, you receive about 15 minutes a visit a day. There's no equivalent of the NHS for the elderly, and people are literally bankrupting themselves. And it is miserable if you have Alzheimer's or have to go into a care home. Some of the most miserable things I saw as an MP were in the homes of poorer, older people. I also, think there's, I don't know, there's so much I would have liked to do in terms of genuinely giving power down to cities and mayors. I would have liked to create in London government housing, affordable public housing for people. I feel that our prison system is a disgrace and we need a much more humane prison system. I think that we are wrecking our countryside. But these are sort of, in a way, details around the edge. I think the fundamental thing for me would have been a new contract with the British people, which is about running a government that's actually competent. So really investing in the civil service, paying civil servants properly, promoting the best of them, recruiting the best people into the civil service, so that we leave behind a country which is better able to govern itself in 20 years' time than it can today.
Another question asks, how do you rate Keir Starmer as a political leader? And do you see the current Labour Party as capable of governing and winning elections?
I think he's a serious guy. And I think we live in a serious country, and I think he would make sensible decisions. I think if you presented him with a decision, he would try to work his way through to what the right thing to do is. He's not a great charismatic communicator, and I think there's a bit of a risk in British politics, which is that we seem to have a model where we kind of lurch from Tony Blair to the slightly grim figure of Gordon Brown, or from David Cameron to the slightly grim figure of Theresa May, and potentially from Boris Johnson to the slightly grim figure of Keir Starmer. And of course, Gordon Brown and Theresa May were not in the end awfully successful, because politics, yes, must be based on people who are serious and competent, and he's got all that in spades. But I think you do need a certain charisma, a certain ability to communicate, a certain liveliness, which he doesn't show very often. I thought his speech in Parliament on Partygate was brilliant. I mean, an extraordinary piece of parliamentary oratory. But too often he disappoints. And I think we live in a world in which people need to be able to communicate, and he seems sort of slightly depressed all the time, which of course is a boon to Boris Johnson, who gives the impression of being perpetually cheerful.
Another question asks, do you think the West is in a free fall compared to nations such as China or Russia? Should this be challenged? If so, how?
Well, we're not in a free fall. I mean, it's largely a crisis of confidence and a crisis of internal and external legitimacy. Our economies continue to perform better than the Russian economy. Right? I mean, overall, in the end, of course, our institutions are more robust, stronger, and there's a reason why many Russians want to live in London rather than Moscow. So there is enormous strength, right, in the West, in Europe, in the United States. The United States in particular, I mean, you know, China is rising. Yes, China is rising quickly, but the United States has still succeeded in the last 20 years in creating companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, which are extraordinary. And I think the United States is still in a very, very powerful position. The problem is that we are going through a period of extraordinary sort of self-doubt and anxiety, where our public is turning ever inwards. Our politicians are chasing the public ever inwards. We've lost confidence about what our values are, or any ability to speak for them at home or abroad. And in the absence of being able to do that, with the possible exception of the Scandinavian countries, we end up weakening ourselves in ways we don't need to. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan was an example of that.
One question asks that an individual did the Gap Year Commission, the successor to the Short Limited Service Commission, which you did. How did you find your year, and do you think it influenced your subsequent career?
Thank you. I mean, it was a great thing to do. So for people on the call who aren't aware of what it is or was, aged 18, you can, between school and university, join the army as an infantry officer, in my case. Caller went into. It was very useful for the rest of my life, because although I went into the Foreign Office and then into politics, obviously I'm dealing with the military all the time. And it was enough time, I guess it's a sort of grand form of internship, to at least have a sense of what the military is about, have a sense of why colonels are treated as living gods, and learn, I think, a lot of values. I mean, I think one of the useful things about the military is it does give you a sense of responsibility, gives you a sense of the importance of initiative, gives you a sense that things need to be done well and on time.
Who do you think would make the best next Tory leader and Prime Minister of the current Conservative Parliamentary Party?
So the people that I rate are Nadim Zahawi, Tom Tugendhat, Sajid Javid. Yeah, I'd probably line up behind any of those three.
Another question asks, how do you think the West can deal with the fact that Putin has seemingly taken over the foreign policy narrative? The idea of NATO aggression was simply a non-issue a few years ago, but now many politicians and the public seem happy to concede the argument to an authoritarian imperialist kleptocracy.
Well, I'm with you. I mean, whoever asked that question, I can't really add much to that. It doesn't really need a question mark at the end. But yes, it's horrifying.
Another question asks, do you think the British political system is capable of change? And you've mentioned how the British cabinet system leads to unqualified individuals in positions of power, but British politics seems completely averse to any sort of ambition.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, of course, of political reform in any country is the problem of turkeys voting for Christmas. I mean, why would MPs who are in the glorious position of being able, without any qualifications, to exercise the great offices of state, give up that right? Which is why generally you need a crisis, and in many instances, almost a revolution to achieve a real change in a constitutional and political system. And Britain is very averse to crises and revolutions and keeps muddling along. But it really is becoming increasingly second-rate. I mean, the Parliament is now becoming what British industry was like in the early 1970s. Parliament is like the British Leyland of the motor industry. It's a real kind of miserable, grim picture of a pompous, complacent, declining institution. It's just sort of lost its cultural vim.
Another question asks, how should the electoral system be reformed to ensure that large majorities can no longer ride through over the democratic accountability?
Well, I think we need to go to a form of proportional representation. I think that would help to unlock change.
Another question asks, if you were Prime Minister, who would occupy your great offices of state, the Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, and Home Secretary, and why?
So I would make somebody called David Gauke the Chancellor. I think he's absolutely tremendous individual. I was very, very lucky to work for him when he was Justice Secretary. Foreign Secretary. Yeah, I'd be interested in somebody like Tom Tugendhat. And as an alternative, I might actually be interested in a professional diplomat. Defense Secretary, I think that Ben Wallace has actually done quite a good job. Home Secretary, interesting. Looking around that, probably a guy called Alex Chalk, very decent guy. Victoria Prentice, I think is a wonderful woman. Gillian Keegan, I'd like to use in a cabinet. Sajid Javid, I'd like to use in a cabinet.
Another question asked is, have you had any strong shifts in opinion since leaving the Conservative Party in 2019?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of strong shifts in opinion. I mean, I think one of them is that I'm beginning to see just how screwed up the system is much more clearly than I could quite see when I was in it. I'm beginning to feel, I think, that, you know, exactly what it is about the whole thing, from the way the whips work to the way that these small parties work, the way candidates are selected and promoted, that makes me understand more why the system is so rotten. But at the center of it, I think, is a problem of character. It's sort of like it's like the sort of decaying temple of a religion that's lost its God. I mean, it feels to me like stumbling across some strange relic in the jungle, but where there is still somehow some priests ritualistically going through business at the high altar, but they can't really remember why they're there or what they're doing.
Was there any chance of you crossing to the Labour Party?
Probably not, because I would find it difficult when I'm basically saying that these parties are screwed to join another party. I mean, I think a lot of what I don't like about the Conservative Party is actually true of the Lib Dems and Labour in terms of the way they work. So I preferred to be an independent. Could I join a Labour government that had a leader that I really admired? Of course. But one would have to be really convinced that the person was really serious and was really in charge and was really doing their job well.
What do you think of Britain's reliance upon the US as an ally? And do you see this posing major issues in the foreseeable future?
Well, it's a big problem, the way that American politics is going. I mean, American politics is getting more and more isolationist, which means that if the United Kingdom for example, goes hard into a place like Afghanistan and ends up being the second largest troop contributor and losing 400 lives. And British politicians have to spend 20 years saying how Afghanistan is absolutely vital to global security. And then suddenly President Biden wakes up one morning and decides to withdraw all the troops and doesn't bother to tell Boris Johnson or answer his calls. So suddenly you're out again. You feel pretty humiliated. And this has been going on more frequently since Donald Trump, and it's also happening under the Biden administration. Because, you know, being an ally of the United States in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s was being an ally of a country which had a pretty consistent long-term foreign policy, where you could be pretty confident that if they put troops in South Korea, those troops would still be there in 70 years' time, that they would keep their commitments on the German border, that they would, you know, if they said that they were serious about the Cold War or the war on terror, that they would stick with it, whatever you thought about those things. Dealing with a partner who can no longer be trusted to remain consistent, whose attention span becomes that short, is very, very difficult. Because if you're the weak junior partner, you end up being dragged along with their lurches, and you end up being made to look ridiculous.
Multiple questions have asked, how do we improve the talent of politicians and the civil service? And another asked if you'd agree with Dominic Cummings about the need for civil service reform.
Yeah, I agree with Dominic Cummings on that. I mean, I think the civil service is in desperate need of reform. Desperate need of reform. But the problem is that there's not much interest in it and not much will behind it. The civil service is a sort of self-licking lollipop. I mean, it's becoming increasingly something which is very internally focused, and where an enormous amount of energy goes into worrying about whether the staff are feeling comfortable, whether they're feeling respected, whether, you know, people are dealing with allegations of bullying or harassment, whether people are getting the work-life balance correct. And these are important things, and they are a correction to a time when the civil service was a tougher organization where there was bullying. So it's understandable that they want to do it, but the pendulum has swung far too far. And what it's meant is that some of the merits of the old civil service, which were a certain toughness, a certain expertise, a certain intellectual rigor, a certain desire to take responsibility and take decisions, has been stripped out. And it no longer feels like an energetic organization, and it needs to be an energetic organization, because if you're going to have amateurs as your ministers, you need very, very competent, energetic civil servants to set the agenda and to challenge and push back against those ministers when they're being daft.
Do you think there's a chance of a more moderate centre-right Conservative Party returning to politics? Or do you think the shift towards a more right-wing liberalism is irreversible? Is this what Conservative voters want?
Well, I think the opportunity for the centre ground is that both Labour and Conservatives are chasing red wall voters. They're absolutely obsessed with people in the northeast of England and with the particular issues and the particular cultural battles there, which is making them increasingly socially illiberal, increasingly anti-immigration, increasingly sort of big state, increasingly anti-London, increasingly anti-European, increasingly isolationist, increasingly populist. That leaves a huge hole in much of England and around London, and indeed a huge hole in Scotland, where that type of politics doesn't work, which is an opportunity for the centre ground. The question is it possible within our electoral system to build that centre ground? There are people like me or David Gauke very happy to work with Lib Dem MPs like Monica Harding. We're working on something called the Britain Project at the moment. And, you know, Tony Blair's been involved. But it's all very well having me and Tony Blair pontificating, but what is the vehicle? There's a hole. There's been a gaping hole in the middle of British politics probably for 30, 40 years now. How do we fill that hole given the system, the party system that we have?
The Conservative Party lacks a great degree of popularity amongst younger voters. How does the party change when its supposed goal is to conserve a system young people feel fundamentally excludes them?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you're quite right. It's got a real problem with younger voters. And that was meant to be fatal for it. Right? The idea was supposed to be that it had this aging voter base and that over time it would wipe it out. But of course, what happened in the 2019 election is they got a sort of unprecedented 80-seat majority off the basis of this new coalition. Part of the problem, of course, is that young people don't vote in sufficient numbers. And so long as these parties, and this is true of the Republican Party of the United States, are able to mobilize older voters, they're fine. And one of the things that the Conservative Party campaigners, of course, say is that, yes, it looks on the surface as though they're doomed because their voter base is old, so demographic change will wipe them out. But what they claim is that actually, no, because simply as time goes on, as soon as you become older, you start voting Conservative. So the problem solves itself. It's not a sort of demographic time bomb under them at all. It's simply some weird life stage political problem.
Recognizing the enormous difficulties, do you think there's a good way to go about international development? What role should Western governments play alongside private NGOs and countries like China?
Gosh, okay, thank you. Now, can I say, if it's all right, because I've got a 4-year-old making a noise in the background, this is my penultimate question, so I'll do this and one more if it's okay. So on international development, I think the main challenge on international development is, unfortunately, a challenge of quality. You know, it's the how you do projects. Do you do them well? There's an enormous amount of theory around international development, but the theory is largely a distraction. The big question is not, should we be doing education or should we be doing primary healthcare? The question is, how do you make sure when you build that clinic in Nigeria that there are medicines on the shelves, there are sheets on the beds, that there isn't human excrement on the floor, and that there are patients turning up? And that's what we are really failing at doing. Right? We've created edifices of theory, but the actual implementation of these projects is lamentable, partly because this bigger problem that I talked about in the civil service is particularly clear with international development, where people lack a sense of direct responsibility for what's going on. They sort of feel that if they've written a strategy paper or a theory of change or a logical framework and all the paperwork's right and the contracts and invoices and receipts have been sorted out, it doesn't really matter that in the end people are starving. They're not really solving the problem. How the hell do you get the food to them?
As a final question, I think I'll go with, what do you think is the biggest waste of taxpayers' money being spent at the moment?
Trident. I think our nuclear deterrent.
I guess we'll end here. Just thank you once again to Rory Stewart for giving us so much time. This Friday we'll be joined by Lord Neuberger, former President of the Supreme Court. Next Monday we'll be joined by Peter Hitchens, and the Monday following that we'll be joined by George Galloway. Thank you everyone for joining, and once again thank you so much to Rory Stewart for giving us so much time. Thank you.
Thank you. Great pleasure, and have a great afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining me on what is 2 hours later in Jordan, but is presumably the middle of your afternoon. So thank you again very much. Have a great afternoon and evening. Bye-bye.